So, you're telling me that all of this actually happened? The young journalist, Daniel, leaned slightly over his cup of cold coffee, his gaze tense yet curious. You were the one who wanted to hear the story. Leo Martinez smiled tiredly, resting against the dark wooden table. And I'm telling it. But, believe me, it's not for the faint-hearted. You see how I live, don't you? This house, it's not just a place. It's a cage. Why didn't you leave? Why did you stay? Daniel nervously adjusted his glasses. Leo frowned, exhaled, and began his story. I grew up in Chicago. A noisy city where it's hard to hear your own thoughts. My father was a mysterious man. He rarely talked about himself, and even less about his past. My mom died when I was a kid. After that, he started drifting away. And then, he disappeared. I searched for him. Years went by in vain attempts to find answers. The only thing left to me was a small inheritance from some distant relative. Then I decided, enough. I wanted peace. That's how I found this house. In photos, it looked cozy. Funny, right? But when I arrived, I immediately felt something was off. It was like the air here was different. Heavy, sticky. But I chalked it up to fatigue and memories. So, Leo chuckled, the first days were strange. The house was cold, the walls seemed to breathe. You ever heard how an old house can make noises, like it's alive? Of course, nodded Daniel. But you, felt something? Not right away, Leo lifted his gaze. The first couple of nights, I'd wake up feeling like someone was watching me. But that wasn't all. On rainy nights, the sound of droplets turned into footsteps. I thought I was losing my mind. But on the third night, I heard knocking in the hallway. What did you do? I shouted, who's there? Leo smirked slightly. The only answer was silence. But that silence, it was too loud, you know? Like the darkness itself was laughing at me. The next day, I decided to explore the house. Just to make sure it was only creaky floors and wind. But under the carpet in the living room, I found a hatch. You ever seen hatches that seem to hide on purpose? That's odd, Daniel muttered. More than odd, Leo nodded. The lock was jammed, but I broke it. Below was a staircase leading to a basement. When I went down, the air there, it was thick, like tar. And in the room itself, a portrait. What kind of portrait? A man. His face looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. And you know what's the strangest thing? Leo stared intently at his companion. In the portrait, his eyes were looking right at me. After that, the real madness began. One night, I found the portrait by my bed. I hadn't moved it. You'd think it was a hallucination, but... Leo paused for a moment, then added, I heard it being moved. The creak of the floorboards was loud, like a scream. Daniel frowned, but didn't interrupt. Then there were shadows. Have you ever noticed how light plays on walls? Well, in my house, it didn't play. The shadows moved on their own. The voice came on the fourth night. It was raspy but familiar. It called me by name. Leo, why are you here? I froze. It was my father's voice. Are you sure? Absolutely. I tried to answer, but no sound came out of my throat. And you know what he said next? You thought you could hide? The truth always finds you. In the morning, I went back to the basement. The portrait had changed. The face on it looked more like my father's. I started digging through the books and notes I found there. They were about rituals, about souls bound to houses. Daniel silently jotted down every word. I realized that this house, it's like a trap. Souls that enter here never leave. That night, it got even worse. The voice screamed, "Finish what I started." The light went out, and I felt a touch. It was cold, like death itself. I screamed and ran out of the room. "What did you do next?" Daniel asked. "Tried to escape. But the doors wouldn't open. The windows wouldn't break. And then the voice said, 'The house is you.'" I realized there was no way out. Daniel put away his notebook, but his hands were trembling. "And how do you?" "I don't live. I exist." Leo stood up, and Daniel noticed how his silhouette merged with the shadows of the room. "This house is now your cage too." The room dimmed, and the last thing Daniel heard was a whisper, "Welcome."